The call that changed everything. Officer Marcus Jennings sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, the familiar hum of the engine reverberating through the quiet streets of Hollywood. It was a sleepy little town where life moved at a slower pace, a far cry from the chaotic urban precincts Marcus had served in his younger days. Now, at 58, he was only months away from retirement, worn but wise from decades of wearing the badge. His partner, Sandra Torres, sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through the dispatch screen. "You ever wonder what retirement's gonna feel like?" Marcus asked, breaking the silence between them. Sandra glanced up with a small grin. "Can't imagine sitting still that long." "What about you? Got any big plans?" Marcus gave a dry chuckle. "Fishing, maybe. A lot of sleeping." He paused. "What about you? Big city cop stuck in a little town. This feel like a vacation yet?" Sandra smiled, adjusting her patrol vest. "It's not so bad. A little quieter, sure, but I can't complain." The radio crackled to life, cutting their conversation short. "Dispatch to Unit 14. 911 call reporting a burglary in progress. Address: 1247 Windbrook Street. Caller is Nate Walker, 82-year-old male, veteran. Please respond." Marcus straightened immediately, all the wariness vanishing from his posture. Burglary reports weren't unheard of, but something about the location made his gut tighten. Windbrook Street was on the far edge of town, dotted with old farmhouses, most abandoned or decaying. It wasn't the sort of place anyone would think to rob unless they were desperate or dangerous. Sandra responded into the radio. "Copy that. Dispatch. Unit 14 en route. ETA, 5 minutes." Marcus flicked on the patrol car's lights, red and blue beams cutting through the quiet night. As they sped through the narrow streets, the odd details of the call gnawed at him. Why would an elderly veteran be the target of a break-in? And why did the unease sitting heavy in his chest feel more than routine? "You know this guy, Nate Walker?" Sandra asked, her sharp brown eyes scanning the road ahead. Marcus shook his head. "No, but there's something off about this. Windbrook's practically deserted. What would a burglar want out there?" "Old folks' houses can be easy targets," Sandra replied. "Maybe some local kids causing trouble." Marcus frowned. "Maybe. But you don't last this long on the force ignoring your instincts. And right now, mine are telling me we need to be real careful." They turned onto Windbrook Street, the houses thinning until only a few lonely structures remained. Most of the homes here were relics of the past, their sagging roofs and broken fences telling stories of better days long gone. A lone porch light flickered at the far end of the street, casting long, jagged shadows across the overgrown yard of Nate Walker's home. "Here we are," Marcus muttered, killing the siren as they pulled up to the curb. The house was small, weather-beaten, and suffocating under years of neglect. Faded paint peeled from the wooden panels, and the front steps sagged under the weight of time. On the porch stood a thin, hunched figure wrapped in layers of mismatched clothing. A graying dog, a Labrador mix by the looks of it, sat faithfully by his side. Marcus stepped out of the patrol car, adjusting his duty belt as he approached the porch. "Mr. Walker, I'm Officer Jennings. This is Officer Torres. We got your call." Nate Walker nodded slowly, his frail frame shaking slightly in the cold night air. "Glad you came," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Heard someone messing around out back. Then the glass broke. Thought I better call before things got worse." The old dog gave a low wag of its tail, staying close to Nate's side, as if ready to protect him despite its own age. "Buddy here raised a fuss," Nate continued, scratching the dog's ears with a trembling hand. "Think it scared whoever it was off, but I don't take chances anymore." Sandra gave Nate a kind smile. "Mind if we take a look around the property, Mr. Walker? Just to make sure everything's clear." Nate nodded, motioning them to follow. "Back windows where they tried to get in. I'll show you." As they walked toward the rear of the house, Marcus kept a close eye on Nate. The old man moved slowly, each step seeming like a struggle, his breath visible in the cold air. Buddy plodded along beside him, never straying far. "Need a hand, Mr. Walker?" Sandra asked, noticing Nate's labored steps. "I'm fine," Nate replied curtly, though his voice betrayed exhaustion. "Just getting old is all." They reached the back of the house, where the shattered window confirmed Nate's story. Glass glittered on the snow-covered ground, and footprints led away from the house toward the street. Marcus knelt, studying the glass pattern and the size of the hole in the window. Something didn't feel right. This wasn't a haphazard smash and grab. The glass suggested precision, as if whoever broke it had done so with a specific intent. "Got footprints," Sandra called out, shining her flashlight on the snow. "Looks like one set. Probably not more than one person." Marcus grunted in acknowledgement but remained focused on the window. The burglary attempt seemed too deliberate, too quiet for a random break-in. Something about the scene didn't add up, and it left him uneasy. "Anything else unusual, Mr. Walker? Maybe a car, voices?" Nate shook his head. "Didn't see or hear anything, just the glass breaking. Then Buddy started barking. That's when I called." Sandra circled the perimeter once more before nodding to Marcus. "Seems quiet now. No sign of anyone hanging around." Marcus turned back to Nate. "Do you mind if we come inside, Mr. Walker? Just to make sure everything's secure and no one else got in." For a moment, hesitation flickered in Nate's tired eyes, but he quickly nodded. Yeah, come on in." As they made their way back to the front of the house, Marcus noticed the subtle sag in Nate's shoulders, the weight of years pressing down on the old man. He exchanged a glance with Sandra, who gave a slight nod. She felt it too. Something was wrong, but it wasn't just a burglary. There was more to this situation than Nate was letting on. When they stepped inside, the warmth hit them like a wall. The air was thick, almost stifling, as if the house had been closed off from the world for too long. The interior told a story of quiet desperation. Cluttered furniture, piles of old newspapers, and scattered mementos of a life lived long ago. Marcus's eyes fell on the stove in the corner of the kitchen, its burners glowing softly. The unsettling realization hit him. Nate had been using the stove to heat his home. "Mr. Walker," Sandra asked gently, "are you using the stove for heat?" Nate's expression hardened, a mix of pride and shame flashing across his face. "Boiler broke last winter," he muttered. "Can't afford to fix it. This keeps me and Buddy warm." Marcus felt his chest tighten. This wasn't just about a broken window. This was survival, plain and simple. And it was clear Nate had been holding on by a thread, too proud to ask for help. "Nate," Marcus began, his voice softer now, "this isn't safe. We need to talk about getting you some help." Nate's eyes darkened, and he shook his head firmly. "Don't need help. I've managed just fine. Always have." Marcus exchanged a helpless look with Sandra. They both knew they couldn't leave Nate like this. The broken window had only been the beginning. What they'd uncovered was a life on the brink. An elderly man, forgotten by the system, clinging to his dignity in a house filled with ghosts of the past. And somehow, Marcus knew this call would stay with him long after his badge was turned in. Beneath the surface, the next morning, Officer Marcus Jennings couldn't shake the lingering unease from the night before. The image of Nate Walker, frail, proud, and visibly defeated, haunted his thoughts as he sat at his kitchen table sipping lukewarm coffee. It wasn't just about the broken window. It was everything. The old man's stubborn defiance, the unsafe living conditions, and the loyal dog at his side, as if they were the last two soldiers left in an abandoned battleground. Something told Marcus that leaving things as they were would be a mistake. He drummed his fingers on the table, deep in thought. Maybe the system failed Nate, but Marcus wasn't willing to let it end there. He knew the law was clear. He couldn't force help on the old man unless there was imminent danger. But still, there had to be something he could do. He needed to get creative. Marcus wasn't new to these kinds of cases. Throughout his long career, he had encountered people on the margins of society, those forgotten by the system, too proud to ask for help. Veterans especially held a place in his heart. His own father had served in Korea and fought his way through years of post-war nightmares and bureaucratic red tape. If his dad were alive, Marcus knew he'd want him to do more than just file a report and walk away. Pulling out his notebook, Marcus jotted down some ideas, chewing the end of his pen in thought. He couldn't stop Nate from refusing help, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way to approach this without making the man feel like a charity case. His thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of his phone. It was Sandra Torres. "Morning, old man," Sandra teased when he picked up. She'd taken to calling him that since they were paired together. "Hey, partner," Marcus replied, trying to muster some cheer. "What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about Mr. Walker." Her tone turned serious. "Something about last night just doesn't sit right with me." "You too, huh?" Marcus said, grateful she felt the same way. "I looked up his name in the system," Sandra continued. "Turns out, Walker's records are bare. No family, no medical records on file, no recent interactions with Veterans Affairs. It's like the man's been living off the grid." "Not surprising," Marcus muttered. "He sounded like someone who's had it with government red tape." Sandra sighed. "Yeah, but here's the thing. Someone like him shouldn't be living in those conditions. He needs help, whether he wants it or not." Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "What are you suggesting?" "Social services already said they can't step in unless he agrees to it, and the guy's too proud to accept anything official." There was a pause on the line before Sandra spoke again, more hesitantly this time. "I've got an idea, but it's a little unconventional." Marcus chuckled. "At this point, unconventional is all we've got. What's your plan?" Later that afternoon, Marcus found himself parked a block away from Nate Walker's home, waiting for Sandra to arrive. She had reached out to someone she knew, a retired social worker named Deborah Green, who specialized in working with veterans. Deborah wasn't affiliated with any government program anymore, which made her the perfect person to help without triggering Nate's pride or distrust. When Sandra pulled up, she wasn't alone. A tall, middle-aged woman with salt and pepper braids and a warm, no-nonsense demeanor climbed out of the passenger seat. She wore a faded green jacket, the kind that suggested she had seen her fair share of tough situations. "You must be Marcus," Deborah greeted with a firm handshake. "Sandra's told me a lot about you, and about Mr. Walker." "Thanks for coming," Marcus said. "I'm hoping you can get through to him. He's not exactly open to help." Deborah gave a knowing smile. "Most veterans aren't, at first, but I've got a few tricks up my sleeve." The three of them approached Nate's house together. Buddy, the old Labrador, greeted them from the porch, his tired eyes watching their every move. Marcus could see the same wariness in the dog that he had seen in Nate the night before, a silent protectiveness, a readiness to stand guard even if the body was no longer strong enough to fight. Nate opened the door a crack when Marcus knocked, peering out at them with a suspicious gaze. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon, officer," Nate said, his voice guarded. His eyes flicked to Sandra and Deborah, clearly sizing them up. "Mr. Walker," Marcus began, keeping his tone light, "I know you said you didn't need any help, but this here is Deborah. She's not with the government or any official agency. She's just a friend who knows a thing or two about taking care of veterans." Nate's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Marcus thought he was going to slam the door in their faces. But then Buddy gave a soft whine and nudged Nate's leg with his nose. The old man hesitated, his hand resting on the doorknob. "Fine," Nate grumbled, opening the door wider. "You can come in. But don't think this means I'm signing up for anything." Deborah smiled warmly. "I wouldn't dream of it." Inside, Deborah took a seat at the cluttered kitchen table, making herself comfortable without waiting for an invitation. Marcus noticed how she immediately shifted the atmosphere, like they were old friends catching up, rather than strangers intruding on Nate's space. "So, you were in the service?" Deborah asked casually, as if making small talk. Nate gave a non-committal grunt. "What branch?" Deborah pressed, her tone light and easy. "Army," Nate muttered. "Korea and a little in Vietnam." Deborah nodded, as if that was exactly what she'd expected. "You know, my brother served in Korea too. Tough war. He used to tell me how cold it got over there. Said it felt like your bones would freeze." Nate's face softened just a little. "Yeah, it was something else." Deborah leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "You know what my brother always missed the most? Good food. Said Army rations were about as close to real food as cardboard is to a steak." That earned a chuckle from Nate, a small one, but it was there. Marcus and Sandra exchanged a glance, silently acknowledging Deborah's skill. She wasn't pushing. She was simply meeting Nate where he was, finding common ground. Over the next hour, Deborah continued the conversation, gently weaving in questions about Nate's life, how he ended up in Hollywood, what Buddy meant to him, and how he managed day to day. Nate slowly began to open up, talking about his late wife, Mary, who had passed 5 years earlier, and how Buddy was the only thing keeping him going some days. Marcus felt his heart ache as Nate described the isolation and loneliness he faced. This wasn't just a man struggling with poverty. It was someone drowning in grief and forgotten by the world. Eventually, Deborah steered the conversation toward practical matters. "You know, Nate," she said, her tone still light, "I've got a friend who works at a nonprofit that provides free heating systems for veterans. No forms, no hassle. They just want to help folks like you and Buddy stay warm." Nate eyed her warily. "And what's the catch?" "No catch," Deborah assured him. "Just a bunch of old veterans looking out for each other." For a long moment, Nate sat in silence, his gaze distant. Then, with a heavy sigh, he nodded. "All right," he whispered, "but just the heating system. No charity." Deborah smiled, reaching across the table to pat his hand. "Deal." As they left the house, Marcus felt a weight lift from his chest. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Nate would get the heat he needed, and maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something more. "You did good, Marcus," Sandra said as they walked back to their car. He gave her a small smile. "We're not done yet, but it's a step." And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt hopeful. Maybe he couldn't change the whole world, but today he'd made a difference in one man's life. And sometimes that was enough. The fire within. Days turned into weeks, and slowly but surely, the pieces of Nate Walker's life began to shift. The nonprofit team Deborah had mentioned arrived as promised, bringing along a portable heater and installing insulation in the drafty windows. They even managed to fix the broken boiler in Nate's basement, which hadn't worked in years. True to Deborah's word, there were no government forms, no strings attached, just a few veterans helping one of their own. Marcus made it a point to drop by every few days, always under the guise of just checking in. It gave him an excuse to keep tabs on Nate without making him feel monitored. Each time, Marcus noticed small but meaningful changes. The house smelled a little less musty, Buddy seemed to move with more energy, and Nate's eyes, once so dull and lifeless, now held a flicker of something like hope. But even as things improved, Marcus knew Nate's journey was far from over. He was surviving, but he wasn't living. There was still a distance in Nate's gaze, a sense that part of him was stuck somewhere deep in the past, beyond the reach of anything or anyone in the present. Marcus had seen it before. The silent burden carried by those who had outlived their comrades, their purpose, and sometimes even themselves. One chilly October afternoon, Marcus arrived at Nate's house to find the old man sitting on the porch with Buddy at his feet, watching the world with a quiet intensity. The heater's hum drifted faintly from inside, proof that at least Nate's home was warm now. Marcus sat down beside him, letting the silence stretch between them. He'd learned early on that with men like Nate, words could be a double-edged sword. Sometimes it was better to let silence do the heavy lifting. After a few minutes, Nate spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "I ever wonder what it's all for." Marcus glanced at him, unsure of how to respond. Nate stared straight ahead, as if the question was more for himself than for anyone else. All those years fighting, watching friends die, some of them not even old enough to shave. Nate's hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white with tension. "And now, what do I got to show for it? A busted house, a half-blind dog, and a whole lot of memories I can't drink away." Marcus felt the weight of those words settle between them, heavy as stone. He thought of his father, who used to sit at the edge of his bed at night, staring at nothing, as if haunted by ghosts only he could see. Some battles never really end. They just change shape. "You still got fight in you, Nate," Marcus said quietly. "I can see it. Maybe it's not about what's behind you. Maybe it's about what you do with what's left." Nate gave a bitter laugh, but there was no real malice in it, just exhaustion. "And what's left, huh? What am I supposed to do at my age? Start fresh?" Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You don't have to start fresh. You just have to start." That night, Marcus lay awake in bed, turning Nate's words over in his mind. He knew the old man wasn't asking for advice. He was asking for meaning. And Marcus also knew that meaning couldn't be handed out like a meal at a soup kitchen. It had to be discovered, earned, and reclaimed. Maybe there was something Nate could fight for again. The answer came to Marcus unexpectedly, like a sudden gust of wind-clearing fog. "Buddy." A few days later, Marcus showed up at Nate's door again, this time with Sandra and a new idea. "We've been thinking," Marcus said as he stood on the porch. "Buddy's a great dog, but he's getting up there in years." Nate's expression darkened. "What are you getting at?" "He's fine. Don't need anyone telling me otherwise." Sandra stepped in, her voice gentle but firm. "No one's saying Buddy's not fine. But what if there was a way to keep him healthy and give you both something to look forward to?" Nate folded his arms, clearly skeptical. "What kind of something?" Marcus grinned. "Have you ever thought about volunteering with Buddy at a local shelter? There are programs where people bring in dogs to visit kids, the elderly, even other veterans. Buddy could brighten a lot of folks' days. And so could you." Nate scowled, but Marcus noticed the flicker of interest that flashed in his eyes. "That sounds like charity," Nate grumbled. "Not charity," Sandra said with a smile. "Community, and I think you'll find there's a big difference." A week later, Nate found himself in unfamiliar territory, a local shelter filled with barking dogs, wagging tails, and the eager faces of children running around the play area. Marcus had driven him there, and although Nate had grumbled the entire way, Buddy seemed thrilled, his tail thumping excitedly against the car seat. The shelter's director, a bubbly woman named Carla, greeted them warmly. "You must be Mr. Walker. And this handsome fellow must be Buddy." Buddy, sensing her friendliness, gave a polite woof in response. "We've got a group of kids in the back who would love to meet him," Carla said. "And I think they'd like to meet you too." Nate shifted uncomfortably, looking like a man who'd wandered into enemy territory without a map. But Marcus gave him a reassuring nod. "It's just a visit, Nate. No strings attached." Reluctantly, Nate followed Carla into the playroom, with Buddy trotting happily beside him. The children gathered around the old Labrador, laughing and petting him as Buddy soaked up the attention. At first, Nate stood awkwardly to the side, unsure of what to do. But then one little girl, no more than 6, tugged at his sleeve. "Is Buddy your dog, mister?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Nate looked down at her, surprised by the question. "Yeah," he said slowly. "He's mine." The girl beamed. "He's the best dog I ever met." For the first time in a long time, Nate felt something stir inside him. A quiet warmth, like the first flicker of a fire after a long, cold night. He crouched down beside Buddy, resting a hand on the old dog's head. "Yeah," Nate whispered, his voice soft. "He is." As the afternoon went on, something remarkable happened. The children gravitated toward Nate, asking him questions, showing him their drawings, and asking if Buddy knew any tricks. And to Marcus's amazement, Nate responded, first with short, curt answers, but gradually with stories. Real stories. He talked about Buddy, about the places he'd been, and even, just a little, about the wars he'd fought in. By the time they left the shelter, Nate looked different. Lighter. For the first time since Marcus had met him, the old man's shoulders weren't slumped under the weight of invisible burdens. As they drove home, Nate turned to Marcus. "You know," he said quietly, "this volunteering thing, it ain't half bad." Marcus smiled. "Told you it wasn't charity." Nate chuckled, a sound that was rare but genuine. "Guess not." And for the first time in a long time, Nate Walker felt like he belonged somewhere again. Not just to the past, but to the present. And maybe, just maybe, to the future too. The past doesn't let go. Winter crept into the town with biting winds and early sunsets. The mornings grew darker, and the nights seemed endless. But for the first time in years, Nate didn't feel trapped inside those long hours. Volunteering with Buddy at the shelter had become a new routine, one that pulled him out of his isolation. The kids adored Buddy, and Nate found himself drawn in by their joy. Their innocence felt like a balm on the old wounds he carried for decades. But even as he embraced the present, the past still clung to him. Old memories had a way of sneaking in when everything seemed quiet. Nights remained the hardest. Buddy's warm body pressed against Nate's leg while they sat in the worn armchair, but that wasn't always enough to stop the flood of thoughts. One night, the dreams returned, sharp, vivid, and relentless. They dragged Nate back to another time, another place. He was on a battlefield again, smoke filling the air, his ears ringing from explosions. Faces flashed before him, some clear, some blurred, men he had fought beside. Some of those faces never made it home. Nate's hands clenched in the dream, the weight of his rifle feeling too real. He could hear the screams of his comrades, the groan of metal, and the dull thud of mortar fire hitting the ground. Then, as quickly as it began, the scene shifted. He was standing over a grave. A buddy of his, Jimmy, lay 6 feet under, a man Nate had sworn to protect but couldn't. Survivor's guilt tore through him like shrapnel, just as sharp now as it had been all those years ago. He woke with a start, gasping for air, his heart hammering in his chest. Buddy, sensing his distress, whined softly and nudged his head into Nate's hand. Nate rubbed the dog's ears, his breath slowly steadying. But the heaviness lingered, wrapping around him like a second skin. The next morning, Marcus stopped by, as he often did. Nate hadn't mentioned the nightmares to anyone. He'd spent most of his life keeping things locked away. But Marcus, with his sharp instincts, knew something was off the moment he saw Nate. "You look like hell," Marcus said, dropping a bag of groceries on the counter. That night, Nate grunted, avoiding his friend's gaze. "I've had worse." Marcus crossed his arms. "Wanna talk about it?" "Nope." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the tension thick between them. Marcus let out a sigh. "Look, Nate, I get it. I do. My old man carried those same nightmares until the day he died. But you don't have to fight this thing alone." Nate shot him a glare. "I've been fighting alone most of my life. Don't need to change that now." Marcus didn't flinch. "Yeah, well, how's that working out for you?" Nate wanted to fire back a sharp retort, but the words died in his throat. He knew Marcus was right, but knowing it and doing something about it were two very different things. A few days later, Sandra came by the house with an unexpected surprise. A small box with a wriggling black nose poking out of the top. "What the hell is that?" Nate asked, eyeing the box warily. Sandra grinned. This is Scout. He's a rescue pup. About 8 months old, full of energy, and in need of a home. Nate scowled. I already got a dog. Sandra knelt down and set the box on the floor. Scout immediately tumbled out, his oversized paws slapping against the wooden boards as he bounded toward Buddy. The old Labrador gave the puppy a weary glance, as if to say, "Kid, I'm too old for this nonsense." But Buddy let the pup lick his face all the same. I know you have a dog, Sandra said softly. But Buddy isn't getting any younger, and I think it might be good for both of you, something new to care about. Nate opened his mouth to argue but stopped when Scout tripped over his own feet and landed in a clumsy heap by Buddy's side. The sight was ridiculous, and for some reason, Nate felt a chuckle rumble in his chest. Sandra smiled. See, he's already working his magic. That night, Nate sat on the floor of his living room, watching Buddy and Scout interact. The puppy was relentless, chewing on Buddy's ear and pouncing on his tail, but Buddy handled him with the patience only an old dog could muster. Nate found himself strangely captivated by the dynamic between them, the old teaching the young, and the young breathing life into the old. It was a reflection of something Nate hadn't realized he needed, a sense of continuity, something to remind him that even when things ended, new beginnings could still sprout from the ashes. He scratched Buddy's head and watched Scout gnaw on a sock he'd stolen from under the couch. Life went on, messy and chaotic, but it went on all the same. And for the first time in a long time, Nate felt like maybe, just maybe, he wanted to be a part of it again. The next time Marcus came by, he found Nate sitting outside on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand and Scout curled up on his lap. The puppy snored softly, his little chest rising and falling in rhythm with Nate's steady breathing. You look different, Marcus said, sitting down beside him. Nate gave a small, tired smile. Guess I feel different. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel heavy. It felt comfortable, like an old coat you hadn't worn in years, but somehow still fit perfectly. After a long moment, Nate spoke. You know, I've been thinking. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Oh, should I be worried? Nate chuckled, a real, genuine laugh that surprised even himself. No, idiot. I've just been thinking that maybe it's not too late. Maybe there's still some good left for me to do. Marcus felt his heart ache as Nate described the isolation and loneliness he faced. This wasn't just a man struggling with poverty. It was someone drowning in grief and forgotten by the world. Eventually, Deborah steered the conversation toward practical matters. You know, Nate, she said, her tone still light. I've got a friend who works at a nonprofit that provides free heating systems for veterans. No forms, no hassle. They just want to help folks like you and Buddy stay warm. Nate eyed her warily. And what's the catch? No catch, Deborah assured him. Just a bunch of old veterans looking out for each other. For a long moment, Nate sat in silence, his gaze distant. Then, with a heavy sigh, he nodded. All right, he whispered, but just the heating system. No charity. Deborah smiled, reaching across the table to pat his hand. Deal. As they left the house, Marcus felt a weight lift from his chest. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Nate would get the heat he needed, and maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something more. You did good, Marcus, Sandra said as they walked back to their car. He gave her a small smile. We're not done yet, but it's a step. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt hopeful. Maybe he couldn't change the whole world, but today he'd made a difference in one man's life. And sometimes that was enough. The fire within. Days turned into weeks, and slowly but surely, the pieces of Nate Walker's life began to shift. The nonprofit team Deborah had mentioned arrived as promised, bringing along a portable heater and installing insulation in the drafty windows. They even managed to fix the broken boiler in Nate's basement, which hadn't worked in years. True to Deborah's word, there were no government forms, no strings attached, just a few veterans helping one of their own. Marcus made it a point to drop by every few days, always under the guise of just checking in. It gave him an excuse to keep tabs on Nate without making him feel monitored. Each time, Marcus noticed small but meaningful changes. The house smelled a little less musty, Buddy seemed to move with more energy, and Nate's eyes, once so dull and lifeless, now held a flicker of something like hope. But even as things improved, Marcus knew Nate's journey was far from over. He was surviving, but he wasn't living. There was still a distance in Nate's gaze, a sense that part of him was stuck somewhere deep in the past, beyond the reach of anything or anyone in the present. Marcus had seen it before. The silent burden carried by those who had outlived their comrades, their purpose, and sometimes even themselves. One chilly October afternoon, Marcus arrived at Nate's house to find the old man sitting on the porch with Buddy at his feet, watching the world with a quiet intensity. The heater's hum drifted faintly from inside, proof that at least Nate's home was warm now. Marcus sat down beside him, letting the silence stretch between them. He'd learned early on that with men like Nate, words could be a double-edged sword. Sometimes it was better to let silence do the heavy lifting. After a few minutes, Nate spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "I ever wonder what it's all for." Marcus glanced at him, unsure of how to respond. Nate stared straight ahead, as if the question was more for himself than for anyone else. All those years fighting, watching friends die, some of them not even old enough to shave. Nate's hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white with tension. And now, what do I got to show for it? A busted house, a half-blind dog, and a whole lot of memories I can't drink away. Marcus felt the weight of those words settle between them, heavy as stone. He thought of his father, who used to sit at the edge of his bed at night, staring at nothing, as if haunted by ghosts only he could see. Some battles never really end. They just change shape. "You still got fight in you, Nate," Marcus said quietly. "I can see it. Maybe it's not about what's behind you. Maybe it's about what you do with what's left." Nate gave a bitter laugh, but there was no real malice in it, just exhaustion. "And what's left, huh? What am I supposed to do at my age? Start fresh?" Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You don't have to start fresh. You just have to start." That night, Marcus lay awake in bed, turning Nate's words over in his mind. He knew the old man wasn't asking for advice. He was asking for meaning. And Marcus also knew that meaning couldn't be handed out like a meal at a soup kitchen. It had to be discovered, earned, and reclaimed. Maybe there was something Nate could fight for again. The answer came to Marcus unexpectedly, like a sudden gust of wind-clearing fog. Buddy. One afternoon, Nate found himself talking to a young Marine named Elijah, who had just returned from his second deployment. The kid was sharp but guarded, wearing his pain like armor. Nate recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror countless times. They talked for hours, Elijah slowly opening up about the things he couldn't tell his family, the fear, the guilt, the crushing weight of loss. Nate didn't have all the answers, but he listened, and that seemed to be enough. By the end of their conversation, Elijah gave Nate a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, old man," the Marine said. "You don't know how much this helps." Nate nodded. "Yeah, I do." Winter melted into spring, and with it, Nate's world began to thaw. He started spending more time at the VA center, even bringing Buddy and Scout along. The dogs became unofficial mascots, their presence providing comfort in ways words never could. At home, things felt lighter too. He began to make small changes, fixing up the backyard, repainting the fence, even putting up bird feeders. Little projects that gave him a sense of purpose. Marcus teased him about becoming domestic, but Nate didn't mind. For the first time in a long time, life felt good. But it wasn't perfect. The nightmares still came, though less frequently. and some days were harder than others. But Nate had learned something important. He didn't have to carry the weight alone. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Nate sat on the porch with Marcus and Sandra, watching Scout wrestle with a stick twice his size, while Buddy observed lazily from the grass. "You've come a long way, old man," Marcus said, nudging Nate with his elbow. Nate smiled, a real one this time. "Yeah, I guess I have." Sandra sipped her lemonade and gave him a knowing look. "So, what's next?" she asked playfully. Nate chuckled. "Next? Hell, who knows? Maybe I'll teach these mutts some new tricks. Or maybe I'll teach myself a few." Marcus laughed. "Now that's something I'd pay to see." As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Nate leaned back in his chair, a deep sense of peace settling over him. The future was uncertain, as it always had been. But for the first time in years, that uncertainty didn't scare him. He had Buddy and Scout. He had Marcus and Sandra. He had the VA center and the new connections he was building, one conversation at a time. And most importantly, he had hope, the kind of quiet, stubborn hope that says, "You've made it this far. Keep going." Life wasn't perfect, but it was his. And that was more than enough. Storms of the past and calm after. One spring afternoon, a storm rolled into town without warning, black clouds consuming the sky. Nate watched from the window as the wind howled, rattling the shutters like restless ghosts. Rain pounded against the roof, and thunder cracked in the distance, loud enough to shake the earth beneath his feet. Scout was terrified, his tiny frame trembling as he tried to burrow under Nate's arm. Buddy, seasoned by many storms, lay beside the couch with his head resting on his paws. The old dog had learned long ago that some storms just had to be endured. As lightning split the sky, memories Nate thought he'd buried deep came roaring to the surface. Flashes of fire, explosions, and the desperate cries of men trapped in the chaos of war. His breathing grew shallow. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in, and the air grew thick with tension. He clenched his fists, his mind drifting back to battles fought long ago. "Not today," Nate muttered through gritted teeth. The nightmares weren't going to win. Not this time. He closed his eyes, grounding himself in the present. Buddy's rhythmic breathing, the warmth of Scout pressed against his side, small anchors in the storm of his mind. Slowly, Nate's heart began to steady. When the rain finally let up, the world outside seemed renewed. The heavy clouds gave way to soft, golden light as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting a warm glow over the drenched landscape. Nate opened the front door, inhaling the scent of wet earth and pine. Scout dashed out onto the porch, shaking off the fear as easily as the raindrops from his fur. Buddy followed at his own pace, giving Nate a knowing glance, as if to say, "See, told you the storm would pass." Nate leaned on the railing, watching the dog sniff around the yard. It was strange how something as simple as a passing storm could dredge up so much. But maybe that was just how life worked. That evening, Marcus stopped by, a six-pack of beer in hand. "Figured I'd check on you," Marcus said, setting the drinks down on the porch table. "Heard the storm was pretty rough." Nate gave a small shrug. "Wasn't too bad." Marcus shot him a look that said he wasn't buying it. Nate chuckled softly, cracking open a beer and taking a long sip. There were few people in his life who could see through his defenses, and Marcus was one of them. The two men sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset bleed across the sky in shades of orange and purple. "You know," Marcus said after a long pause, "you've come a hell of a long way since I first dragged you out of that house." Nate nodded, tracing the rim of his beer can with his thumb. "Yeah, but some days still hit hard." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful look on his face. "Maybe that's just how it goes, man. Storms come, they mess with you, and then they leave. But you're still here when they're gone. That's what matters." Nate didn't respond right away. He knew Marcus was right. The storms of the past would never fully disappear, but they didn't have to define him anymore. The next morning, Nate woke early to the sound of Scout barking excitedly at the birds in the yard. With a groan, he rolled out of bed, Buddy thumping his tail as Nate shuffled to the door. All right, I'm coming," Nate grumbled as Scout practically bounced with excitement. He let the dogs out, smiling as Scout chased after a robin, and Buddy meandered toward his favorite patch of grass. The simple joy in their actions was contagious. For the first time in years, Nate felt eager to start the day. There were no grand plans, no urgent tasks, just the steady rhythm of life, filled with small moments that mattered. Later that afternoon, Nate drove into town, Buddy and Scout riding in the back seat, tongues lolling happily out the windows. They stopped by the local pet store, where Nate picked up a new toy for Scout, a squeaky ball that the pup immediately became obsessed with. "Looks like someone's spoiled," the cashier said with a grin as Scout trotted around the store, showing off his prize. Nate chuckled. "Yeah, well, he's earned it." From there, they made their way to the VA Center, where Nate had promised to help organize a small event for fellow veterans. It was a barbecue, a simple gathering with burgers, music, and old stories told over the crackle of a fire. The kind of event that reminded Nate of the camaraderie he'd missed for so long. As they arrived, Elijah greeted them with a broad smile. "Hey, old man. Brought the dynamic duo, huh?" Nate smirked. "You bet. They'd never forgive me if I left them behind." Buddy and Scout were instant hits, weaving through the crowd, collecting pats and belly rubs from every direction. For many of the vets, the dogs provided a kind of comfort words couldn't, reminders of home, loyalty, and unconditional love. As the sun set and the barbecue wound down, Nate found himself sitting by the fire, a cold drink in hand. Elijah sat beside him, tossing a stick for Scout to chase, while Buddy dozed at their feet. "You know," Elijah said quietly, "I've been thinking about what you told me last time we talked, about how it's okay to let people in." Nate glanced at the younger man, a flicker of pride warming his chest. It wasn't often that you saw someone take advice to heart, but Elijah was trying. And that meant everything. "Yeah," Nate said, raising an eyebrow. "How's that working out for you?" Elijah gave a small, lopsided grin. "Still figuring it out, but it helps knowing I'm not the only one." Nate nodded, staring into the flames. It was strange, in a way, how life had come full circle. He'd spent years shutting people out, convinced that he didn't need anyone. But now, here he was, sitting by a fire, surrounded by people who understood, who cared. And it felt good. When Nate and the dogs finally headed home that night, the stars were bright above them, scattered across the sky like tiny points of hope. Scout curled up in the back seat, worn out from the day's adventures, while Buddy rested his chin on Nate's shoulder, the way he always did. As Nate pulled into the driveway and cut the engine, he sat for a moment in the quiet, taking it all in. The house, the dogs, the friendships he'd built, the life he never thought he'd have again. He smiled to himself, a deep, contented smile that came from knowing that, despite the storms, he was still standing. The past would always be there, but so would the future, and for the first time in a long time, Nate was ready to embrace it. "Come on, boys," Nate whispered, patting Buddy's head. "Let's go home." And as they walked inside together, an old soldier, an even older dog, and a rambunctious pup just beginning his journey. Nate knew that whatever storms came next, they'd weather them together.